Here we are, Phase 3 of the MCU. Phase 3 is by far the longest phase, to the point where it's basically 2 in 1. The phase comprises of 11 movies, almost the same as Phase 1 and 2 combined. Because of that, we're actually going to be splitting this phase into 2 videos. In this video here, we're going to talk about the first 5 films released between 2016 and 2017, and in the next video we'll talk about the last 6 movies released between 2018 and 2019. So let's just get straight into it. Phase 3 begins with Captain America Civil War. Borrowing concepts from the infamous Civil War storyline, this film is in a lot of ways less of a Captain America movie and more of like a micro Avengers movie with 2 of the original Avengers missing. The creative team behind The Winter Soldier returns, with the Russo brothers directing and Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely returning to write. The film is set roughly a year after Ultron's defeat in the second Avengers film. During a mission in Lagos, Wanda Maximoff accidentally diverts a suicide bomber's blast into a nearby building, killing several workers from the country of Wakanda. Following this, the UN prepares to pass a series of bills that would lead the UN to have control over the Avengers and control the decisions that they make. And this completely divides the Avengers, with Tony Stark supporting this, feeling guilty over the devastation caused by Ultron, and Steve Rogers believing more in his own judgment. Bucky Barnes, who is still being controlled due to the brainwashing by Hydra, goes to Vienna, where he blows up the conference where this bill is being discussed. This kills Wakandan King T'Chaka, leading his son T'Challa to vow for revenge. Shortly after, Steve finds Bucky and discovers that he basically has his memories back and that a man named Helmut Zemo had caused the bombing. Steve, Sam Wilson and Bucky then go rogue, and with the help of Wanda, Clint Barton and Scott Lang, go to apprehend him. However, at the same time, Tony creates his own team comprising of Natasha, T'Challa, James Rhodes, Vision and Peter Parker, who Tony finds after videos of him as Spider-Man go viral. So then the rest of the film is a battle between these 2 teams. When I caught up with the MCU movies before Infinity War came out, Civil War was one of the last films I watched. It came at a point where I really did not care about superhero movies at all, and the first time around I thought it was one of the best films in the universe. Upon a second viewing, although I definitely don't think it's anywhere near as good as I remember it being, I still think this film is a lot of fun and one of the best in Phase 3. A lot is going on in this movie and I think most of it works incredibly well. This film is a sequel to Winter Soldier and basically a sequel to Iron Man 3 at the same time. It introduces 2 new superheroes with Black Panther and Spider-Man, and it also brings Ant-Man into the Avengers and develops Vision and Wanda's relationship, if only briefly. This film is basically just Avengers 2.5, but it definitely focuses more on Steve and Bucky, and I think for the most part the film does a good job of cramming all this stuff in without it ever feeling super crowded. There are a few bits that I do think could have been cut out, and I do think the film is way too long, but I don't think they did a terrible job, all things considered. I do wish Vision and Wanda's relationship was developed a little bit more in the film, because apart from like what we see in Infinity War and the recent WandaVision show, we never really got to see a lot of them together. Visually, the film isn't the best. It suffers from that big colouring issue that plagues a lot of the MCU, where everything just looks so washed out and drab. Although most of Phase 3 definitely fixed that issue and is much more bright and colourful, with this film it kind of looks more like a Phase 2 film where everything's like just unnecessarily dark and broody. There's also quite a bit of shaky cam, especially in the first action scene, and it makes the film a little bit disorienting and hard to follow. But luckily during the big battle scene at the beginning of the third act, this isn't a big problem at all. The big battle between the 2 teams of superheroes is of course the main draw of the film, and it is the best bit also. I dare say it's one of the best action sequences in the MCU. It's incredibly exciting, well choreographed, and splices in humour very effectively. Each character gets their time to shine, and I think the film does a great job of using their powers and abilities in very creative ways. The visual effects in this this scene and throughout the entire film are pretty great and hold up incredibly well. Even like the de-aging of Robert Downey Jr. early in the film looks pretty decent still. It's not quite as incredible as like the de-aging in like Blade Runner 2049 or something, but it definitely is much better than some of the worst I've seen. The film is about regret and consequences, and I think these themes are tackled quite well. There was so much excessive damage caused in some of the previous movies, especially Age of Ultron, so it's good to see the impact that it's had on the characters and the universe surrounding them. However, it does feel very southern, like the way it's brought in. Like, Steve didn't care before, but when a building with Wakandans in it is blown up, then that was too far. Or like Tony didn't care before, but when he was shown a face of one of the people who died, that's when he realized he shouldn't have done what he did. It seems a bit strange the way it's kind of just suddenly forced in. There are a lot of moments that actually fill in a lot of the plot holes caused by Age of Ultron not explaining a lot. Like, they explain what happened for Tony in between Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron, and it's nice to see. A lot of the scenes where they're like filling in those plot holes feel like them almost like correcting a mistake. Past the action, a lot of the film is like a political drama with characters debating the ethics of their decisions, and that stuff I do enjoy, but I also think some of it can be quite repetitive. The introduction of Black Panther and Spider-Man into the universe is both great. I love the fact that despite Spider-Man being the most beloved and well-known Marvel character, they dedicate no more time to introducing him than they did with Black Panther. The casting of both, with Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa and Tom Holland as Peter Parker, are also both great, and I love their performances in this film. It's obvious from the get-go that Marvel knew Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. had a lot of great comedic chemistry together, and they clicked really well. Their comedic timing is both great, and the scene of their like first meeting and interacting is a lot of fun. I'm glad to see they don't delve into the Uncle Ben origin story shit again. We've seen done like twice already. When we meet Peter in this film, he's been fighting crime for almost half a year, and I love that. It shows him early enough where he still makes mistakes and is like figuring things out. Like, he's not fully formed yet, but we don't have to be like completely introduced to him like from the beginning and go through like a backstory again like they probably could have done. Overall, Captain America Civil War is a very flawed but entertaining movie. It's not quite as good as The Winter Soldier, but as like a micro Avengers movie, it works incredibly well. It's a great start to Phase 3, and although I don't like it as much on a second viewing, I definitely still think it's one of the best in the whole phase. Doctor Strange is a very weird movie. It's like somehow both an interesting sidestep away from the standard Marvel formula, but at the same time one of the more average films in the MCU. It's at times visually fantastic and full of huge set pieces that explore other dimensions and the astral plane in an incredibly inventive and interesting way, but it also kind of lacks depth in a lot of ways. The film follows Stephen Strange, a wealthy and incredibly arrogant neurosurgeon who, after a bad car crash, is left unable to operate. On a journey to find experimental fixes, he is led to Kamar Taj, where he meets a sorcerer known as the Ancient One. She reveals to Strange their hidden world of magic and alternate dimensions that they have spent years mastering. Desperate to heal himself, Strange starts to study hard and learn the powers that those in the commune possess. Once he masters them, he has to team up with the other sorcerers to fight Caecilius, an ex-student of the Ancient One who has stolen ancient mystical texts and plans to use his powers to take over the world. There is a lot in this film that I like or even love. Visually, the film is fantastic. I love the use of colours in this movie. Like I said with Civil War, a lot of this phase actually is much more bright and colourful, and you can definitely see that coming in this film. Although the world surrounding the characters is like very drab and bland looking, everything created by magic is just super vibrant and colourful. It has a great juxtaposition between the two that I love. The usage of magic feels quite fresh for the MCU, and all the outer body world manipulation sequences are incredibly vibrant, exciting and entertaining. Much of the film is created using excessive CGI, and people may be put off by that, but I do think it's a good looking movie. The action sequences are all pretty well choreographed, and even if I think a lot of it is just kind of average Marvel action, there are still some creative and unique sequences. The acting is pretty good throughout. I wouldn't say there's anyone who phones it in or delivers a particularly bad performance. Benedict Cumberbatch is really good in the lead role, even if like his American accent is quite rough. Tilda Swinton is of course as great as ever as the Ancient One. Like, she's just like a consistently incredible actress. And Mads Mikkelsen is quite good as the villain, I guess. I don't think he's utilized that well at all. His character's like the most cookie cutter villain possible. Nothing is interesting about his character, he's just kind of there, and it's a real shame because he's like one of the best actors around. But for me, I think the biggest problem I have with the film is just the story and character development. This is just a standard origin story. A guy starts as an arrogant dick and is put through a traumatic experience which leads him to like build himself up and become stronger and better than ever. We saw it in Iron Man and Thor previously. We really don't need to go through this again. At least like Ant-Man and Captain America did something slightly different to this formula to make it more interesting. As well as this, I just don't think Doctor Strange is a very interesting character. In Infinity War, I think he's utilized quite well and he's a lot more fun to watch, but here I just find him so dull. And I think the poor attempts at comedy really don't help. Like, the character is like a smarmy wisecracker, but nothing he says is very funny or memorable. The character is just consistently unlikable. They're clearly trying to make him witty and charismatic, but I'm not buying it at all. Tonally, I think the film is kind of all over the place. Most of the film is quite deadpan, but occasionally they cram in these comedic moments and it just feels so out of place and forced. Not to mention the fact that these comedic moments are really unfunny. Honestly, this isn't a film that leaves me with a lot to talk about. I think the visuals and action sequences are all great and some of the most inventive in the MCU, but the rest of the film is pretty average and forgettable. I've seen this film twice now, one of those times less than 48 hours before writing this script, and still the only things I really remember from it are like the set pieces in the first act, which I do actually enjoy a fair amount. This is far from the worst MCU movie or even the worst movie of this phase. It's enjoyable and at times very creative, but it's not great. In between Ant-Man and Black Panther, the only other MCU movie that I'd actually watched was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Although I was sick of Marvel movies at this point, the original Guardians movie was so detached from the rest of the MCU that it was one I still loved and regularly returned to. Before this video, I'd only actually seen the sequel once, but I really enjoyed it. So rewatching it, I was pleasantly surprised to see that not only it held up on the second viewing, it's possibly become my favourite MCU movie to date. While on the run, the Guardians accidentally crash land on a planet. This planet happens to be inhabited by Peter Quill's father, Ego. Ego and Quill start to become close as Quill discovers that Ego is a celestial. However, things aren't quite as they seem and things start to unravel. At the same time, Gamora's sister Nebula is on a path to capture the Guardians and kill Gamora once and for all. Like the first film, the story is pretty basic and the film is much more about seeing these characters go on like this massive multi-pathed adventure, and it's an incredibly entertaining one. The characters are all developed incredibly well and James Gunn does a fantastic job of playing to every single actor's strengths. Chris Pratt is once again hilarious and incredibly witty, but he really gets to show off his much more emotional side in this film and it works incredibly well. I love the progression they make with Nebula, fleshing her out massively and making her somewhat layered. Drax is given more of a secondary role and is much more comedic and innocent, and I think it really works well and suits the character. While I don't think every joke hits well, for the most part he is consistently very funny. The addition of Baby Groot was a great idea also, although it seems quite obviously kind of put in there for like easy laughs and to sell toys. I think it works quite well. He was constantly funny and adorable, especially in like the great opening credits sequence which shows him like running around and dancing to Mr. Blue Sky while the other Guardians fight a huge monster. It was understandable why he was like a huge thing back in 2017. Ego is probably one of the best villains in the MCU simply because they actually make him like a somewhat interesting character. So many of them are super one-dimensional and forgettable, but this is an actual character with depth, and I think he's well written and well performed. I also love the development of Yondu's character. They do him great justice in this film, and I think he's my favourite character in it. Visually, this film looks gorgeous. Like I've said multiple times in this video, the MCU has had a problem with colours being quite dull previously, but this film is literally the complete opposite. Like, the colours are so ridiculously bright and highly saturated. It has this like comic book cartoon look to the film that I absolutely love. The blending of practical effects with CGI works incredibly well once again and creates one of the best looking MCU movies to date, and a film that looks better than many blockbuster movies do today. Even despite a couple of green screen moments that are badly lit and look a little bit ropey, the set designs are all fantastic. I especially love the sequence on the planet Sovereign at the beginning. There's such a huge grandness to it, and the blue and gold look to everything is so creative. I also love like their remote control fleet that is controlled like an arcade game with 8-bit sound effects. It's such a cool little touch that I love. Just like the first movie, the score is pretty average blockbuster music, but the soundtrack of licensed music is fantastic. This film genuinely has one of the best soundtracks of licensed music I've heard in a film from the last decade. The original movie's soundtrack was great, but this one somehow tops it. It's gonna be hard for the third one to top this soundtrack, considering it has like Mr. Blue Sky, The Chain, Surrender, Fox on the Run, Southern Nights, and My Sweet Lord on it, but I believe in you, James Gunn. Overall, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is about as entertaining and emotionally powerful as blockbuster movies get. It's a visual treat, has great performances, an incredible soundtrack, and is consistently hilarious. I love these characters so much, and I cannot wait till the third movie in 2023. Spider-Man coming to the MCU was a gigantic achievement for Marvel. For years, the rights to Spider-Man in movie form were exclusively owned by Sony. As long as they made a new film every few years, they would keep onto the rights, which is exactly what they've done, and it's led to some very questionable results. Considering the mass hatred towards the Amazing Spider-Man movies, it made complete sense for Sony to make a deal with Marvel. The first MCU Spider-Man movie, Homecoming, was a big step up over the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and probably Spider-Man 3 also, but it's still not like an incredible movie. It's a very entertaining movie, but it doesn't reach the height of the first two Spider-Man movies or Into the Spider-Verse. Following the events of Civil War, Peter Parker goes back to studying at school as Tony Stark tells him he isn't ready to be a full Avenger yet. Peter starts quitting multiple after-school activities to focus on crime fighting. One night he discovers a group of criminals robbing an ATM with advanced weapons. He slowly starts to investigate these weapons and discovers that they were created and salvaged from technology scavenged from the aftermath following the Battle of New York and the Avengers. Headed by Adrian Toomes, Peter Parker has to bring down the whole operation and prove himself to be worthy. At the same time, there is this high school comedy plot going on with Peter having a crush on a girl called Liz and the awkwardness of that whole thing. Compared to most of the other Marvel movies that are filled with like huge set pieces and just a grand general epic scale, this film is incredibly down to earth and small. The stakes don't feel apocalyptic, and I think that fits the Spider-Man character perfectly. Although I love the time with Spider-Man, there are huge fight sequences. For the most part, his fights are much smaller in scale. The film is structured like a high school comedy rather than a superhero movie. It follows the basic 3-act structure that comedies do, but with this superhero action element thrown in. There's even a cheesy montage at one point, which I actually really enjoyed. Visually, the film is incredibly basic, like you'd expect a comedy in its vein to be, and I think these elements come together to make something different from the other MCU movies. However, I do still think it comes out quite generic in the end. The action scenes are fun, but not very creative. It's a step up from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which was just cringy, but it's still not amazing. The casting of Tom Holland as Peter Parker was perfect. His comedic timing is great and adds that witty edge to the character that none of the other films have managed to nail. He manages to capture that balance of confidence and awkwardness that the character's supposed to have, especially in his high school days, and it's helped by the at times very funny writing. 3 different writing teams were working on the film at some point, including Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, best known for writing Horrible Bosses and directing Game Night, as well as Chris McKenna and Eric Summers, who were both writers for American Dad and Community. It's surprising the film works as well as it does considering how many writers were on it, and it does feel very coherent even with the tonal shifts throughout. There are a lot of great comedic moments, especially the scene at the beginning showing Peter Parker filming the entirety of his Civil War experiences like a YouTube vlog. It's a really hilarious sequence. I also love the dynamic between Peter and Tony once again. Their comedic chemistry is great, but in this film the relationship is like far more serious than in any of the other movies. Tony Stark is basically like a dad who is fun to be around but incredibly strict when he needs to be, and I think there's a great dynamic between the two. Michael Keaton is also great as the villain, and it's nice to see him show up in more mainstream movies because he's one of my favourite actors. Overall, Spider-Man Homecoming is a good movie. The blending of the superhero formula with the formula of a teen comedy is interesting and for the most part executed very well. However, I do think the film struggles to do anything super original to keep it exciting from beginning to end. There are a lot of moments that drag on a bit, and I think maybe the film could have lost like 15-20 minutes to make it a much leaner and better experience, but it's a good return to form for the character and a nice way to introduce us to his new era. And that brings us to the last film of the first half of Phase 3, Thor Ragnarok. When I caught up on the MCU just before Infinity War came out, Thor Ragnarok was one that I was very much looking forward to. Although I don't really like the first 2 Thor movies, I loved the 80s neon look to this film and I'd heard nothing but good things about it. And this has ended up becoming one of my most watched MCU movies since then. The film is set 2 years after the events of Age of Ultron. Thor returns to Asgard to find his brother Loki posing as Odin. After exposing Loki, he agrees to help him find Odin. When they find him, he explains that Ragnarok, a prophesied destruction of Asgard, is on its way. He also explains that he is dying, and once he passes, his firstborn child Hela will be released from a prison and will attempt to conquer Asgard. He dies and she returns, destroying Mjolnir and sending them running out into space. Thor crash lands on Sakaar, a garbage planet surrounded by wormholes, where he's captured by 142, also known as Valkyrie, and is forced to compete in a gladiator battle where he faces up against the Hulk. After the fight, Thor manages to convince 142, Hulk and Loki to team up with him to stop Hela from taking over Asgard and causing Ragnarok. The film was directed by Taika Waititi, and you can definitely tell this film is just a straight up comedy, and Taika perfectly managed to blend his dry improvised style with the MCU formula to create something that feels incredibly fresh and unique. Supposedly around 80% of the dialogue was improvised, and you can definitely tell. Each actor has incredible comedic timing and pull off the dry and loose feel perfectly. Although the MCU have clearly made Thor more and more comedic as the films go on, I think this is the film that really nails it and shows just how funny Chris Hemsworth can be. But as well as this, there are so many other great characters and performances that are hilarious to watch. 142 is especially funny in her first scene where she shows up incredibly drunk. Taika Waititi's character Korg is hilarious, and the conversations between him and Thor make me laugh out loud every time. And Jeff Goldblum's character, the Grand Master, is basically the perfect role for him. It feels like it was written completely for him, and his incredibly awkward nature makes him so hilarious to watch. Hulk is also in the film, and I really love the way they introduce him at the beginning of the second act. It's just a shame they didn't keep it a secret in the marketing. I think people would have gone crazy to see him show up had they not known he was in the film, and it's a real shame. Also, for some reason, he sounds like he's been auto-tuned all throughout. It's really weird and distracting, and I have no clue why they decided it sounded good. Like, anytime he speaks, it just takes me straight out the film. I'm very glad that they ended up going back to just a normal voice in the other films. The effect work is as great as ever, even if the film is obviously incredibly dependent on CGI. I love all the designs of the locations, and there is some great set design when they actually use sets. The general world of Sakaar is a very interesting planet that feels like some mix of Earth with like Tatooine or something else from Star Wars. The world feels huge and really lived in, and I just find it an incredibly engrossing world to be in. Visually, I think the film just looks gorgeous, and I love how bright and colourful it is. There are a few points where the colours do feel a little bit muted, but for the most part it's a very vibrant and eye-catching movie. The score is one of the best scores to any Marvel, dare I say the best score generally, blending orchestral stuff with 80s synthwave in an incredibly unique and interesting way. Mark Mothersbaugh did a really great job here, and although there aren't any super memorable themes, it does a great job of building mood and setting the tone. Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin is also used in like a couple of key scenes, and I do really love its inclusion. However, I do think it would have been better if it was only used the once. It plays in the opening scene and during the big third act battle, and I think it would have hit so much harder if they just kept it till the end. But regardless, I think its usage is great and it really fits the vibe of the film. Overall, Thor Ragnarok is not only one of the best Marvel movies to date, it's just a massive step in the right direction for the Thor series. I'm glad to see Taika Waititi break into the mainstream like this, because I think he's an incredibly talented director and I've pretty much loved all of his films so far. I'm excited to see Love and Thunder, and hopefully it's just as good, if not better than this. And that's the first half of Phase 3, aka the consistent half. The second half is pretty all over the place. Yeah, not looking forward to some of those films.